does the sun send to here its rays of warmth and life? This is the Underdark, the secret world beneath the bustling surface of the Forgotten Realms, whose sky is a ceiling of heartless stone, and whose walls show the gray blandness of death in the torchlight of the foolish surface dwellers that stumble. This is not their world, not the world of light. Most who come here uninvited.
Nice little dab before we start. While we start.
Those who do escape to the safety of their surface homes return changed. Their eyes have seen the shadows in the gloom, the inevitable doom of the Underdark. Dark corridors meander throughout the dark realm in winding courses, connecting caverns great and small with ceilings high and wide. Mounds of stone as pointed as the teeth of a sweeping dragon lean down in silent threat, or rise up to block the way of intruders. There's a silence here, profound and foreboding, the crouched hush of a predator.
Might get a little loud, everyone.
The only sound, the only reminder of the travelers of the Underdark that they have not lost their sense of hearing altogether, is a distant and echoing drip of water, deep into the heart of the beast, slipping through the silent stones to the deep underground pools of chilled water. The story of secrets are at the ground, where horrors meet the foolish, only the imagination and for the stillness is the story. This is the Underdark. There are pockets of life here, cities as great as many of those on the surface. Around any of the countless bends and turns in the gray stone, a traveler might stumble suddenly into the perimeter of such a city, a stark contrast to the emptiness of the corridors. These places are not illusions, only the foolish traveler would assume. They are the homes of the most evil race. Most of them are one such cabin, 2 miles wide and 1,000 feet high, looms Menzel Barrens, a monument to the otherworldly and ultimately deadly grace that marks the race of Drow elves. Menzel Barrens are not a large city by Drow standards, only 20,000 inhabitants. Where, in ages past, there had been an empty cavern of roughly shaped stalactites and stalagmites, now stands artistry. Row after row of carved castles, thrumming in a quiet glow of magic. The city is a perfection of form, where not a stone has been left to its natural shape. This sense of order and control, however, is but a cruel facade, a deception hiding the secrets of violence that rule the world. Like the they are a beautiful, slender, and delicate people, with features
Nice little
sharp
carb cap.
Yet the Drow are the rulers of this unruly world, the deadliest of the deadly, and all other races take cautious note of their passing. Beauty itself pales at the end of
Nice,
the dark elf sword.
Nice pulsar
The
piece.
Drow are the survivors, and this is the Underdark, the Valley of Death, the land of nameless nightmares. Part 1. Station. Ambition overrides good sense, and compassion is thrown away in its face, all in the name of love, the Spider Queen. Ascension to power in Drow society is a simple process of assassination. The Spider Queen is a deity, and she and her high priestesses, the true rulers of the Drow, do not look with ill favor upon ambitious individuals wielding poisoned daggers. Of course, there are rules of behavior. Every society must boast of these. To openly commit murder or wage war invites the pretense of justice, and penalties exacted in the name of Drow justice are merciless. To stick a dagger in the during the chaos or in the quiet shadows of an alley, however, is investigation is not the forte of drow justice. No one cares enough to bother. Station is the way of love, the ambition she bestows to further the chaos, to keep her drow children along their appointed course of self-imprisonment. Children, pawns will wait, dancing dolls for the spider queen, puppets on the imperceptible 30 strands. All climb the spider queen's ladders. All hunt
That hit
for
kind of
pleasure,
hurt.
and all fall to the hunt.
That was a good dab, though.
Station is the paradox of the world of my people. The limitation of our power within the hunger for power. It is gained through treachery and invites treachery. Those most powerful in Menzo Baranzan spend their days watching over their shoulders, defending against the daggers that would find their backs. Their deaths usually come from the front. Drizzt Do'Urden. 1. Menzo Baranzan. To a surface dweller, he might have passed undetected only a foot away. The padded footfalls of his lizard mount were too light to be heard, and the pliable and perfectly crafted mesh armor that both rider and mount wore bent and creased with their movements, as well as if the suits had grown over their skin. Dean's lizard trotted along in an easy floating over the broken floor, up the walls, and even across the long tunnel ceiling. Subterranean lizards, with their sticky and soft three-toed feet, were preferred mounts for just this ability to scale stone as easily as a spider. Crossing hard ground left no damning tracks in the lighted surface world, but nearly all of the creatures of the Underdark possessed infravision, the ability to see in the infrared spectrum. Footfalls left heat residue that could easily be tracked if they followed a predictable course along the corridor's floor. Dean clamped tight to his saddle as the lizard plodded along a stretch of the ceiling, then sprang out in a twisting descent to a point farther along the wall. Dean did not want to be tracked. He had no light to guide him, but he needed none. He was a dark elf, a drow, an ebon-skinned cousin of those sylvan folk who danced under the stars on the world's surface. To Dinan's superior eyes, which translated subtle variations of heat into vivid and colorful images, the Underdark was far from a lightless place. Colors all across the spectrum swirled before him in the stone of the walls and the floor, heated by some distant fissure or hot stream. The heat of living things was the most distinctive, letting the dark elf view his enemies in details as intricate as any surface dweller would find in brilliant daylight. Normally, Dean would not have left the city. The world of the Underdark was too dangerous for solo treks, even for a drow elf. This time was different. Dean had to be certain that no unfriendly drow eyes marked his passage. A soft glow beyond the sculpted archway told the drow that he neared the city's entrance, and he slowed the lizard's pace accordingly. Few used this narrow tunnel, which opened into Tir Bresh, the northern section of Menzo Baranzan, devoted to the academy, and none but the mistresses and masters, the instructors of the academy, could pass through here without attracting suspicion. Dean was always nervous when he came to this point. Of the 100 tunnels that opened off the main cavern of Menzo Baranzan, this one was the best guarded. Beyond the archway, twin statues of gigantic spiders set in quiet defense. If an enemy crossed through, the spiders would animate and attack, and alarms would be sounded throughout the academy. Dean dismounted, leaving his lizard clinging comfortably to a wall at his chest level. He reached under the collar of his Buafra, his magical shielding cloak, and took out his neck purse. From this, Dean produced the insignia of House Do'Urden, a spider wielding various weapons in each of its 8 legs, and emblazoned with the letters DN for Daemon Nahashes Bear, the ancient and formal name of House Do'Urden. "You will await my return," Dean whispered to the lizard as he waved the insignia before him. As with all the drow elves, the insignia of House Do'Urden held several magical duianos, one of which gave family members absolute control over the house pets. The lizard would obey unfailingly, holding its position as though it were rooted to the stone, even if a scurry rat, its favorite morsel, napped a few feet from its maw. Dean took a deep breath and gingerly stepped to the archway. He could see the spiders leering down at him from their 15-foot height. He was a drow of the city, not an enemy, and could pass through any other tunnel unconcerned. But the academy was an unpredictable place. Dean had heard that the spiders often refused entry, viciously, even to uninvited drow. He could not be delayed by fears and possibilities, Dean reminded himself. His business was of the utmost importance to his family's battle plans. Looking straight ahead, away from the towering spiders, he strode between them and onto the floor of Tir Bresh. He moved to the side and paused, first to be certain that no one lurked nearby, and to admire the sweeping view of Menzo Berenstain. No one, drow or otherwise, had ever looked out from this spot without a sense of wonder at the drow city. Tir Bresh was the highest point on the floor of the 2-mile cavern, affording a panoramic view to the rest of Menzo Berenstain. The cubby of the academy was narrow, holding only the 3 structures that comprised the drow school: Eric Tinalith, the spider-shaped school of law; Sorcerre, the gracefully curving, many-spired tower of wizardry; and Melee Mage, the somewhat plain pyramidal structure where man-fighters learned their trade. Beyond Tir Bresh, through the ornate stalagmite columns that marked the entrance to the academy, the cavern dropped away quickly and spread wide, going far beyond Dinan's line of vision to either side and farther back than his keen eyes could possibly see. The colors of Menzo Berenstain were threefold to the sensitive eyes of the drow. Heat patterns from various fissures and hot springs swirled about the entire cavern. Purple and red, bright yellow and sunny blue, crossed and merged, climbed the walls and stalagmite mounds, or ran off singularly in cutting lines against the backdrop of dim gray stone. More confined than these generalized and natural gradations of color in the infrared spectrum were the regions of intense magic, like the spiders Dean had walked between, virtually glowing with energy. Finally, there were the actual lights of the city, fairy fire and highlighted sculptures on the houses. The drow were proud of the beauty of their designs, and especially ornate columns or perfectly crafted gargoyles were almost always limned in permanent magical lights. Even from this distance, Dean could make out House Bayanri, first house of Menzo Berenstain. It encompassed 20 stalagmite pillars and half again that number of gigantic stalactites. House Bayanri had existed for 5,000 years, since the founding of Menzo Berenstain, and in that time the work to perfect the house's art had never ceased. Practically every inch of the immense structure glowed in fairy fire, blue at the outlying towers, and brilliant purple at the huge central dome. The sharp light of candles, foreign to the Underdark, glared through some of the windows of the distant houses. Only clerics or wizards would light the fires, Dean knew, as necessary pains in their world of scrolls and parchments. This was Menzo Berenstain, the city of drow. 20,000 dark elves lived here, 20,000 soldiers in the army of evil. A wicked smile crossed Dean's thin lips when he thought of some of those soldiers who would fall this night. Dean studied Narvandale, the huge central pillar that served as the time clock of Menzo Berenstain. Narvandale was the only way the drow had to mark the passage of time, in a world that otherwise knew no days and no seasons. At the end of each day, the city's appointed archmage cast his magical fires into the base of the stone pillar. There the spell lingered throughout the cycle, a full day on the surface, and gradually spread its warmth up the structure of Narvandale until the whole of it glowed red in the infrared spectrum. The pillar was fully dark now, cooled since the Dweomer's fires had expired. The wizard was even now at the base, Dean reasoned, ready to begin the cycle anew. It was midnight, the appointed hour. Dean moved away from the spiders and the tunnel exit and crept along the side of Tir Bresh, seeking the shadows of heat patterns in the wall, which would effectively hide the distinct outline of his own body temperature. He came at last to Sorcerer, the school of wizardry, and slipped into the narrow alley between the tower's curving base and Tyr Bresh's outer wall. Student or master, came the expected whisper. Only a master may walk out of house in Tyr Bresh in the black death of Norway.
1 second.
A heavily robed figure moved around the arc of the structure to stand before Dean. The stranger remained in the customary posture of a master of the Drow Academy, his arms out before him and bent at the elbows, his hands tight together, one on top of the other in front of his chest. That pose was the only thing about this one that seemed normal to Dean. Greetings, faceless one. He signaled in the silent hand code of the Drow, a language as detailed as the spoken word. The quiver of Dinan's hands belied his calm face, though, for the sight of this wizard put him as far on the edge of his nerves as he had ever been. Second boy Do'Urden, the wizard replied in a gesture code. Have you my payment? You will be compensated, Dinan signaled pointedly, regaining his composure in the first swelling bubbles of his temper. Do you dare to doubt the promise of Malice Do'Urden, matron mother of Dairman Nahasha's Bairnin, 10th house of Menzo Baranzon? The faceless one slumped back, knowing he had erred. My apologies, second boy of House Do'Urden, he answered, dropping to one knee in a gesture of surrender. Since he had entered this conspiracy, the wizard had feared that his impatience might cost him his life. He had been caught in the violent throes of one of his own magical experiments, the tragedy melting away all of his facial features and leaving behind a blank hotspot of white and green goo. Matron Malice Do'Urden, reputedly as skilled as anyone in all the vast city in mixing potions and salves, had offered him a sliver of hope that he could not pass by. No pity found its way into Dinan's callous heart, but House Do'Urden knew the wizard. You will get your salve, Dinan promised calmly, when Alton Devere is dead. Of course, the wizard agreed. This night? Dinan crossed his arms and considered the question. Matron Malice had instructed him that Alton Devere should die even as their family's battle commenced. That scenario now seemed too clean, too easy to deal with. The faceless one did not miss the sparkle that suddenly brightened the scarlet glow in the young Do'Urden's heat-sensing eyes. Wait for Narvandale's light to approach its zenith, Dinan replied, his hands working through the signals excitedly, and his grimace seeming more of a twisted grin. Should the doomed boy know of his house's fate before he dies? The wizard asked, guessing the wicked intentions behind Dinan's instructions. As the killing blow falls, answered Dinan, die without hope. Dinan retrieved his mind and sped off down the empty corridors, finding an intersecting route that would take him in through a different entrance to the city proper. He came in along the eastern end of the great cavern, Menzo Baranzon's produce section, where no Drow families would see that he had been outside the city limits, and where only a few unremarkable stalagmite pillars rose up from a flat stone. Dinan spurred his mount along the banks of Donegal, the city's small pond, with its moss-covered island that housed a fair-sized herd of cattle-like creatures called Rothe. 100 goblins and orcs looked up from their herding and fishing duties to mark the Drow soldiers' swift passage. Knowing their restrictions as slaves, they took care not to look Dinan in the eye. Dinan would have paid them no heed anyway. He was too concerned by the urgency of the moment. He kicked his lizard to even greater speeds when he again was on the flattened, curving avenues between the glowing Drow castles. He moved toward the south-central region of the city, toward the grove of giant mushrooms, the last section of the finest houses in Menzo Baranzon. As he came around one blind turn, he nearly ran over a group of 4 wandering bugbears. The giant, hairy goblin things paused a moment to consider the Drow, then moved slowly but purposefully out of his way. The bugbears recognized him as a member of House Do'Urden, Dinan knew. He was a noble, a son of a high priestess, and his surname, Do'Urden, was the name of his house. Of the 20,000 dark elves in Menzo Baranzon, only 1,000 or so were nobles, actually the children of the 67 recognized families of the city. The rest were common soldiers. Bugbears were not stupid creatures. They knew a noble from a common. And though drow elves did not carry their family insignia in plain view, the pointed and tailed cut of Deaning's stark white hair and the distinctive pattern of
Bruno's
purple
doing
and
good
red
tonight.
lines in his black coiffure told them well enough who he was. The mission's urgency pressed upon Dean, but he could not ignore the bugbear's slight. How fast would they have scampered away if he had been a member of House Baenri, or one of the other 7 ruling houses, he wondered. You will learn respect of House Do'Urden soon enough, the dark elf whispered under his breath, as he turned and charged his lizard at the group. The bugbears broke into a run, turning down an alley strewn with stones and debris. Dean found his satisfaction by calling on the innate powers of his race. He summoned a globe of darkness, impervious to both infravision and normal sight, in the fleeing creature's path. He supposed that it was unwise to call such attention to himself, but a moment later, when he heard crashes and sputtered curses as the bugbears stumbled blindly over the stones, he felt it was worth the risk. His anger sated, he moved off again, picking a more careful route through the heat shadows. As a member of the 10th house of the city, Deanan could go as he pleased within the giant cavern without question, but Matron Malice had made it clear that no one connected to House Do'Urden was to be caught anywhere near the mushroom grove. Matron Malice, Deanan's mother, was not to be crossed, but it was only a rule after all. In Menzoberranzan, one rule took precedence over all of the petty others. Don't get caught. At the mushroom grove's southern end, the impetuous drow found what he was looking for. A cluster of 5 huge floor-to-ceiling pillars that were hollowed into a network of chambers and connected with metal and stone parapets and bridges. Red glowing gargoyles, the standard of the house, glared down from 100 perches like silent sentries. This was House Devere, 4th house of Menzoberranzan. A stockade of tall mushrooms ringed the place, every 5th one a shrieker, a sentient fungus named and favored as guardians for the shrill cries of alarm it emitted whenever a living being passed it by. Deanan kept a cautious distance, not wanting to set off one of the shriekers, and knowing also that other, more deadly lords protected the fortress. Matron Malice would see to those. An expectant hush permeated the air of this city section. It was general knowledge throughout Menzoberranzan that Matron Jinifet of House Devere had fallen out of favor with Lolth, the spider queen deity to all drow, and the true source of every house's strength. Such circumstances were never openly discussed among the drow, but everyone who knew fully expected that some family lower in the city hierarchy soon would strike out against the crippled House Devere. Matron Jinifet and her family had been the last to learn of the Spider Queen's displeasure, ever was that Lolth's devious way. And Deanan could tell just by scanning the outside of House Devere that the doomed family had not found sufficient time to erect proper defenses. Devere sported nearly 400 soldiers, many female, but those that Deanan could now see at their posts along the parapets seemed nervous and unsure. Deanan's smile spread even wider when he thought of his own house, which grew in power daily under the cunning guidance of Matron Malice. With all 3 of his sisters rapidly approaching the status of High Priestess, his brother an accomplished wizard, and his uncle Zaknafane, the finest weapons master in all of Menzoberranzan, busily training the 300 soldiers, House Do'Urden was a complete force. And Matron Malice, unlike Jinifet, was in the Spider Queen's full favor. Damn Nahash's Baird, Deanan muttered under his breath, using a formal and ancestral reference to House Do'Urden, 9th house of Menzoberranzan. He liked the sound of it. Halfway across the city, beyond the silver-glowing balcony and the arched doorway 20 feet up the cavern's west wall, sat the principals of House Do'Urden, gathered to outline the final plans of the night's work. On the raised dais at the back of the small audience chamber sat venerable Matron Malice, her belly swollen in the final hours of pregnancy. Flanking her in their places of honor were her 3 daughters, Maya, Vierna, and the eldest, Briza, a newly ordained High Priestess of Lolth. Maya and Vierna appeared as younger versions of their mother, slender and deceptively small, though possessing great strength. Breeza, though, hardly carried the family resemblance. She was big, huge by drow standards, and rounded in the shoulders and hips. Those who knew Breeza well figured that her size was merely a circumstance of her temperament. A smaller body could not have contained the anger and brutal streak of House Do'Urden's newest High Priestess. Dinan should return soon, remarked Risen, the present patron of the family, to let us know if the time is right for the assault. We go before Narvandale finds its morning glow, Breeza snapped at him in her thick but razor-sharp voice. She turned and smiled to her mother, seeking approval for putting the male in his place. The child comes this night, Matron Malice explained to her anxious husband. We go no matter what news Dinan bears. It will be a boy child, groaned Breeza, making no effort to hide her disappointment. Third living son of House Do'Urden. To be sacrificed to Lolth, put in Zakna Faye, a former patron of the house, who now held the important position of weapons master. The skilled drow fighter seemed quite pleased at the thought of sacrifice, as did Malthane, the family's eldest son, who stood at Zak's side. Malthane was the elder boy, and he needed no more competition beyond Dinan within the ranks of House Do'Urden. In accord with custom, Breeza glowered, and the red of her eyes brightened. To aid in our victory. Risen shifted uncomfortably. Matron Malice, he dared to speak. You know well the difficulties of birthing. Might the pain distract you? You dare to question the matron mother? Breeza started sharply, reaching for the snake-headed whip so comfortably strapped and writhing on her belt. Matron Malice stopped her with an outstretched hand. Attend to the fighting, the matron said to Risen. Let the females of the house see to the important matters of this battle. Risen shifted again and dropped his gaze. Dinan came to the magically wrought fence that connected the keep within the city's west wall with the two small stalagmite towers of House Do'Urden, and which formed the courtyard to the compound. The fence was adamantine, the hardest metal in all the world, and adorning it were 100 weapon-wielding spider carvings, each ensorcelled with deadly glyphs and wards. The mighty gate of House Do'Urden was the envy of many a drow house, but so soon after viewing the spectacular houses in the mushroom grove, Dinan could only find disappointment when looking upon his own abode. The compound was plain and somewhat bare, as was the section of wall, with the notable exception of the mithril and adamantine balcony running along the second level, by the arched doorway reserved for the nobility of the family. Each baluster of that balcony sported 1,000 carvings, all of which blended into a single piece of art. House Do'Urden, unlike the great majority of the houses in Menzoberranzan, did not stand free within groves of stalactites and stalagmites. The bulk of the structure was within a cave, and while this setup was indisputably defensible, Dinan found himself wishing that his family could show a bit more grandeur. An excited soldier rushed to open the gate for the returning second boy. Dinan swept past him without so much as a word of greeting and moved across the courtyard, conscious of the 100 and more curious glances that fell upon him. The soldiers and slaves knew that Dinan's mission this night had something to do with the anticipated battle. No stairway led to the silvery balcony of House Do'Urden's second level. This, too, was a precautionary measure designed to segregate the leaders of the house from the rabble and the slaves. Drow nobles needed no stairs. Another manifestation of their innate magical abilities allowed them the power of levitation. With hardly a conscious thought to the act, Dinan drifted easily through the air and dropped onto the balcony. He rushed through the archway and down the house's main central corridor, which was dimly lit in the soft hues of fairy fire, allowing for sight in the normal light spectrum, but not bright enough to defeat the use of infravision. The ornate brass door at the corridor's end marked the second boy's destination, and he paused before it to allow his eyes to shift back to the infrared spectrum. Unlike the corridor, the room beyond the door had no light source. It was the audience hall of the High Priestesses, the anteroom to House Do'Urden's grand chapel. The drow clerical rooms, in accord with the dark rites of the Spider Queen, were not places of light. When he felt he was prepared, Dinan pushed straight through the door, shoving past the two shocked female guards without hesitation and moving boldly to stand before his mother. All three of the family daughters narrowed their gaze at their brash and pretentious brother. To enter without permission, he knew they were thinking. Would that it was he who was to be sacrificed this night. As much as he enjoyed testing the limitations of his inferior's station as a male, Dinan could not ignore the threatening dances of Vierna, Maya, and Brisa. Being female, they were bigger and stronger than Dinan, and had trained all their lives in the use of wicked drow clerical powers and weapons. Dinan watched as enchanted extensions of the clerics, the dreaded snake-headed whips on his sister's belts, began writhing in anticipation of the punishment they would exact. The handles were adamantine and ordinary enough, but the whip's blades and multiple heads were living serpents. Brisa's whip in particular, a wicked six-headed device, danced and squirmed, tying itself into knots around the belt that held it. Brisa was always the quickest to punish. Matron Malice, however, seemed pleased by Dinan's swagger. The second boy knew his place well enough by her measure, and he followed her commands fearlessly and without question. Dinan took comfort in the calmness of his mother's face, quite the opposite of the shining, white-hot faces of his three sisters. All is ready, he said to her. House de Vere huddles within its fence, except for Alton, of course, foolishly attending his studies at Sorcerer. You have met with the Faceless One, Matron Malice asked. The Academy was quiet this night, Dinan replied. Our meeting went off perfectly. He has agreed to our contract. Alton de Vere will be dealt with accordingly, Dinan chuckled. He then remembered the slight alteration he had made in Matron Malice's plans, delaying Alton's execution for the sake of his own lust for added cruelty. Dinan's thought evoked another recollection as well. High priestesses of Loth had an unnerving talent for reading thoughts. Alton will this night, Dinan quickly completed the answer, assuring the others before they could probe him for more definite details. Excellent, Brisa groaned. Dinan breathed a little easier. To the man, Matron Malice ordered. The four drow males moved to kneel before the matron and her daughters, risen to Malice, Zacnafane to Brisa, Nalfane to Maya, and Dinan to Vierna. The clerics chanted in unison, placing one hand delicately upon the forehead of their respective soldier, tuning into his passions. You know your places, Matron Malice said when the ceremony was complete. She grimaced through the pain of another contraction. Let our work begin. Less than an hour later, Zacnafane and Brisa stood together on the balcony outside the upper entrance to House Doherty. Below them, on the cavern floor, the second and third brigades of the family army, Risens and Nalfanes, bustled about, fitting on heated leather straps and metal patches, camouflage against a distinctive elven form to heat-seeing drow eyes. Dinan's group, the initial strike force that included 100 goblin slaves, had long since departed. We will be known after this night, Brisa said. None would have suspected that a 10th house would dare to move against one as powerful as de Vere. When the whispers ripple out after this night's bloody work, even Behenry will take note of Dairman Naashes Ben. She leaned out over the balcony to watch as the two brigades formed into lines and started out, silently, along separate paths that would bring them through the winding city to the Mushroom Grove and the five-pillared structure of House de Vere. Zacnafane eyed the back of Matron Malice's eldest daughter, wanting nothing more than to put a dagger into her spine. As always, though, good judgment kept Zac's practiced hand in its place. Have you the articles? Brisa inquired, showing Zac considerably more respect than she had when Matron Malice sat protectively at her side. Zac was only a male, a commoner allowed to don the family name as his own, because he sometimes served Matron Malice in a husbandly manner, and had once been the patron of the house. Still, Brisa feared to anger him. Zac was the weapons master of House de Vere, a tall, man, stronger than most females, and those who had witnessed his fighting wrath considered him among the finest warriors of either sex in all of Menzo Barenzo. Besides Brisa and her mother, both high priestesses of the Spider Queen, Zacnafane, with his unrivaled swordsmanship, was House Doherty's trump. Zack held up the black hood and opened the small pouch on his belt, revealing several tiny ceramic spheres. Riza smiled evilly and rubbed her slender hands together. Matron Jennifer will not be pleased, she whispered. Zack returned the smile and turned to view the departing soldiers. Nothing gave the weapons master more pleasure than killing drow elves, particularly clerics of law. Prepare yourself, Riza said after a few minutes. Zack shook his thick hair back from his face and stood rigid, eyes tightly closed. Riza drew her wand slowly, beginning the chant that would activate the device. She tapped Zack on one shoulder, then the other, then held the wand motionless over his head. Zack felt the frosty sprinkles falling down on him, permeating his clothes and armor, even his flesh, until he and all of his possessions had cooled to a uniform temperature and hue. Zack hated the magical chill. It felt as he imagined death would feel, but he knew that under the influence of the wand's sprinkles he was, to the heat-sensing eyes of the creatures of the Underdark, as gray as common stone, unremarkable and undetectable. Zack opened his eyes and shuddered, flexing his fingers to be sure they could still perform the fine edge of his craft. He looked back to Briza, already in the midst of the second spell, the summit. This one would take a while, so Zack leaned back against the wall and considered again the pleasant, though dangerous task before him. How thoughtful of Matron Mellis to leave all of House de Vere's clerics to him. It is done, Briza announced after a few minutes. She led Zack's gaze up to the darkness beneath the unseen ceiling of the immense
1 second, everyone.
Zack spotted Briza's handiwork first, an approaching current of air, yellow-tinted and warmer than the normal air of the cavern, a living current of air. The creature, a conjuration from an elemental plane, swirled to hover just beyond the lip of the balcony, obediently awaiting its summoner's commands. Zack didn't hesitate. He leaped out into the thing's midst, letting it hold him suspended above the floor. Briza offered him a final salute and motioned her servant away. Good fighting, she called to Zack, though he was already invisible in the air above her. Zack chuckled at the irony of her words as the twisting city of Menzoberranzan rolled out below him. She wanted the clerics of House de Vere dead as surely as Zack did, but for very different reasons. All complications aside, Zack would have been just as happy killing clerics of House de Werden. The weapons master took up one of his adamantine swords, a drow weapon magically crafted and unbelievably sharp, with the edge of killing Driarms. Good fighting indeed, he whispered. If only Briza knew how good. 2. The Fall of House de Vere. Dean noted with satisfaction that any of the meandering bugbears, or any of the other of the multitude of races that composed Menzoberranzan, drow included, now made great haste to scurry out of his way. This time, the second boy of House de Werden was not alone. Nearly 60 soldiers of the house walked in tight lines behind him. Behind these, in similar order, though with far less enthusiasm for the adventure, came 100 armed slaves of lesser races. Goblins, orcs, and bugbears. There could be no doubt for onlookers. A drow house was on a march to war. This was not an everyday event in Menzoberranzan, but neither was it unexpected. At least once every decade, a house decided that its position within the city hierarchy could be improved by another house's elimination. It was a risky proposition, for all of the nobles of the victim house had to be disposed of quickly and quietly. If even one survived to lay an accusation upon the perpetrator, the attacking house would be eradicated by Menzoberranzan's merciless system of justice. If the raid was executed to devious perfection, no recourse would be forthcoming. All of the city, even the ruling council of the top 8 patron mothers, would secretly applaud the attackers for their courage and intelligence, and no more would ever be said of the incident. Neiman took a roundabout route, not wanting to lay a direct trail between House de Werden and House de Vere. A half-hour later, for the second time that night, he crept to the mushroom grove's southern end. to the cluster of stalagmites that held House de Vere. His soldiers streamed out behind him eagerly, readying weapons and taking full measure of the structure before them. The slaves were slower in their movement. Many of them looked about for some escape, for they knew in their hearts that they were doomed in this battle. They feared the wrath of the Dark Elves more than death itself, though, and would not attempt to flee. With every exit out of Menzoberranzan protected by devious drow magic, where could they possibly go? Every one of them had witnessed the brutal punishments the drow elves exacted on recaptured slaves. At Dinan's command, they jumped into their positions around the mushroom fence. Dinan reached into his large pouch and pulled out a heated sheet of metal. He flashed the object, brightened in the infrared spectrum 3 times behind him to signal the approaching brigades of Nalfin and Risen. Then, with his usual confidence, Dinan spun it quickly into the air, caught it, and replaced it in the secrecy of his heat-shielding pouch. On cue with the twirling signal, Dinan's drow brigade fitted enchanted darts to their tiny handheld crossbows and took aim on the appointed targets. Every 5th mushroom was a shriek, and every dart held a magical guiana that could silence the roar of a dragon. 2, 3, Dinan counted, his hand signaling the tempo, since no words could be heard within the sphere of magical silence cast about his troops. He imagined the click as the drawn string on his little weapon released, loosing the dart into the nearest shriek. So it went all around the cluster of House de Vere, the first line of alarms systematically silenced by 36 enchanted darts. Halfway across Menzoberranzan, Matron Malice, her daughters, and 4 of the house's common clerics were gathered in Lolth's unholy circle of 8. They ringed an idol of their wicked deity, a gemstone carving of a drow-faced spider, and called to Lolth for aid in their struggles. Malice sat at the head, propped in a chair angled for Bertha. Briza and Vierna flanked her, Briza clutching her hand. The select group chanted in unison, combining their energies into a single offensive spell. A moment later, when Vierna, mentally linked to Dinan, understood that the first attack group was in position, the Doerdan Circle of 8 sent the first insinuating waves of mental energy into the rival house. Matron Jinnifer, her 2 daughters, and the 5 principal clerics of the common troops of House de Vere huddled together in the darkened anteroom of the 5 stalagmite house's main chapel. They had gathered there in solemn prayer every night since Matron Jinnifer had learned that she had fallen into Lolth's disfavor. Jinnifer understood how vulnerable her house remained until she could find a way to appease the Spider Queen. There were 66 other houses in Menzoberranzan, fully 20 of which might dare to attack House de Vere at such an obvious disadvantage. The 8 clerics were anxious now, somehow suspecting that this night would be eventful. Jinnifer felt it first, a chilling blast of confusing perceptions that caused her to stutter over her prayer of forgiveness. The other clerics of House de Vere glanced nervously at the matron's uncharacteristic slip of words, looking for confirmation. "We are under attack," Jinnifer breathed to them, her head already pounding with a dull ache under the growing assault of the formidable clerics of House Doerdan. A second signal from Dinan put the slave troops into motion. Still using stealth as their ally, they quietly rushed to the mushroom fence and cut through with wide-bladed swords. The second boy of House Doerdan watched and enjoyed as the courtyard of House de Vere was easily penetrated. "Not such a prepared guard," he whispered in silent sarcasm to the red-glowing gargoyles on the high walls. The statues had seen such an ominous guard earlier that night. Now they just watched helplessly. Dinan recognized the measured but growing anticipation in the soldiers around him. Their drow battle lust was barely contained. Every now and then came a killing flash as one of the slaves stumbled over a warding glyph. But the second boy and the other drow only laughed at the spectacle. The lesser races were the expendable fodder of House Doerdan's army. The only purpose in bringing the goblinoids to House de Vere was to trigger the deadly traps and defenses along the perimeter, to lead the way for the drow elves, the true soldiers. The fence was now opened and secrecy was thrown away. House de Vere's soldiers met the invading slaves head-on within the compound. Dinan barely had his hand up to begin the attack command when his 60 anxious brow warriors jumped up and charged, their faces twisted in wicked glee and their weapons waving menacingly. They halted their approach on cue, though, remembering one final thing set out to them. Every drow, noble or commoner, possessed certain magical abilities, bringing forth a globe of darkness, as Dinan had done to the bugbears in the street earlier that night, came easily to even the lowliest of the Dark Elves. So it went now, with 60 Do'Urden soldiers blotting out the perimeter of House de Vere, above the mushroom fence in ball after ball of blackness. For all of their stealth and precautions, House Do'Urden knew that many eyes were watching the raid. Witnesses were not too much of a problem. They could not or would not care enough to identify the attacking house. But custom and rules demanded that certain attempts at secrecy be enacted, the etiquette of drow warfare. In the blink of a red glowing drow eye, House de Vere became, to the rest of the city, a dark blot on Menzo Berenzon's landscape. Risen came up behind his youngest son. Well done, he signaled in the intricate finger language of the drow. Now fate is in through the back. An easy victory, the cocky demon signaled back, if Matron Jennifer and her clerics are held at bay. Trust in Matron Malice, was Risen's response. He clapped his son's shoulder and followed his troops in through the breached mushroom fence. High above the cluster of House de Vere, Zaknafein rested comfortably in the current arms of Breeze's aerial servant, watching the drama unfold. From this vantage, Zack could see within the ring of darkness, and could hear within the ring of magical silence. Dinan's troops, the first drow soldiers in, had met resistance at every door and were being beaten badly. Malthane and his brigade, the troops of House Do'Urden most practiced in the ways of wizardry, came through the fence at the rear of the complex. Lightning strikes and magical balls of acid thundered into the courtyard at the base of the de Vere structures, cutting down Do'Urden fodder and de Vere defenses alike. In the front courtyard, Risen and Dinan commanded the finest fighters of House Do'Urden. The blessings of Lolth were with his house, Zack could see when the battle was fully joined. For the strikes of the soldiers of House Do'Urden came faster than those of their enemies, and their aim proved more deadly. In minutes, the battle had been taken fully inside the 5 pillars. Zack stretched the incessant chill out of his arms and willed the aerial serpent to action. Down he plummeted on his windy bed, and he fell free the last few feet to the terrace along the top chambers of the central pillar. At once, 2 guards, one a female, rushed out to greet him. They hesitated in confusion, though, trying to sort out the true form of this unremarkable gray blur. Too long. They had never heard of Zaknafein Do'Urden. They didn't know that death was upon them. Zack's whip flashed out, catching and gashing the female's throat, while his other hand walked his sword through a series of masterful thrusts and parries that put the male off balance. Zack finished both in a single blurring movement, snapping the whip-entwined female from the terrace with a twist of his wrist, and spinning a kick into the male's face that likewise dropped him to the cavern floor. Zack was then inside, where another guard rose up to meet him, but fell at his feet. Zack slipped along the curving wall of the stalactite tower, his cooled body blending perfectly with the stone. Soldiers of House de Vere rushed all about him, trying to formulate some defense against the host of intruders who had already won out the lowest level of every structure and had taken 2 of the pillars completely. Zack was not concerned with them. He blocked out the clanging ring of adamantine weapons, the cries of command, and the screams of death, concentrating instead on a singular sound that would lead him to his destination, a unified, frantic chant. He found an empty corridor covered with spider carpets and running into the center of the pillar. As in House Do'Urden, this corridor ended in a large set of ornate double doors, their decorations dominated by arachnid forms. This must be the place, Zack muttered under his breath, fitting his hood to the top of his head. A giant spider rushed out of its concealment to his side. Zack dived to his belly and kicked out under the thing, spinning into a roll that plunged his sword deep into the monster's bulbous body. Sticky fluids gushed out over the weapons master, and the spider shuddered to a quick death. Yes, Zack whispered, wiping the spider juices from his face. This must be the place. He pulled the dead monster back into its hidden cubby and slipped in beside the thing, hoping that no one had noticed the brief struggle. By the sounds of ringing weapons, Zack could tell that the fighting had almost reached this floor. House de Vere now seemed to have its defenses in place, though, and was finally holding its ground. Now, Malice, Zack whispered, hoping that Briza, attuned to him now, would sense his anxiety. Let us not be late. Back in the clerical anteroom of House de Vere, Malice and her subordinates continued their brutal mental assault on the clerics of House de Vere. Lolth heard their prayers louder than those of their counterparts, giving the clerics of House de Urden the stronger spells in their mental combat. Already they had easily put their enemies into a defensive posture. One of the lesser priestesses in de Vere's Circle of Eight had been crushed by Briza's mental insinuations, and now lay dead on the floor, barely inches from Matron Ginefe's feet. But the momentum had slowed suddenly, and the battle seemed to be swinging back to an even level. Matron Malice, struggling with the impending birth, could not hold her concentration, and without her voice, the spells of her unholy circle weakened. At her mother's side, powerful Briza clutched her mother's hand so tightly that all the blood was squeezed from it, leaving it cool, the only cool spot on a laboring female, to the eyes of the others. Briza studied the contractions and the crowning cap of the coming child's white hair, and calculated the time to the moment of birth. This technique of translating the pain of birth into an offensive spell attack had never been tried before, except in legend, and Briza knew that timing would be the critical factor. She whispered to her mother's ear, coaxing out the words of a deadly incantation. Matron Malice echoed back the beginnings of the spell, sublimating her gasps and transforming her rage of agony into offensive power. "Didn't do it, not reckon told," Briza implored. "Didn't do it, ma reckon told," Malice growled, so determined to focus through the pain that she bit through one of her thin lips. The baby's head appeared, more fully this time, and this time to stay. Briza trembled and could barely remember the incantation herself. She whispered the final rune into the matron's ear, almost fearing the consequences. Malice gathered her breath and her courage. She could feel the tingling of the spell as clearly as the pain of the birth. Through her daughters standing around the idol, staring at her in disbelief, she appeared as a red blur of heated fury, streaking sweat lines that shone as brightly as the heat of boiling water. "Arbeck," the matron began, feeling the pressure building to a crescendo. "Arbeck." She felt the hot tear of her skin, the sudden slippery release as the baby's head pushed through, the sudden ecstasy of birthing. "Arbeck, dinna break, do it!" Malice screamed, pushing away all of the agony and a final explosion of magical power that knocked even the clerics of her own house from their feet. Carried on the thrust of Matron Malice's exultation, the Dweomer thundered into the chapel of House de Vere, shattered the gemstone idol of Lolth, sundered the double doors into heaps of twisted metal, and threw Matron Ginefe and her overmatched subordinates to the floor. Zack shook his head in disbelief as the chapel doors flew past him. "Way to kick, Malice," he chuckled and spun around the entryway into the chapel.
Alright, everyone, probably gonna call into this live and try to get some sleep.
7 living occupants, all struggling back to their
I want to thank everyone that stopped by. Until next time, everyone.
A snap of his whip